In the heart of Viridia, a city on the cusp of tearing down its most iconic building, the Pinnacle, a structure long celebrated as the masterpiece of the acclaimed architect Alistair Croft, a secret lay dormant. For 80 years, the truth was not etched in history books or university lectures, but buried deep within the foundation, waiting for the deafening roar of demolition to finally speak its name. The Pinnacle soared into the skyline, a symphony of glass and steel that had defined Viridia for the better part of a century. It was more than a building. It was a landmark, a point of pride, a testament to the city's ambition. Now, progress demanded its removal for a sprawling new commercial complex. The public watched with a bittersweet resignation, a mix of nostalgia for the old and anticipation for the new. News crews set up their cameras, ready to capture the end of an era, filming the grand old structure as if it were a dying monarch, regal and stoic even in its final moments. Alistair Croft was a titan of 20th century architecture. His name was synonymous with genius, his legacy literally set in stone across the country. He was the man who had supposedly sketched the Pinnacle on a cocktail napkin, a flash of inspiration that would reshape modern design. Textbooks lauded his bold use of structural expressionism, his uncompromising vision. He had died decades ago, but his myth was as solid and imposing as the buildings he had created, a carefully constructed narrative of a lone, brilliant man who saw the world in lines and angles nobody else could. My name is Leo, and I was there on that final day. As a junior architect and historical consultant for the demolition firm, my job was to document the building's deconstruction, ensuring its historical elements were catalogued. I had studied Croft's work for years, a reluctant admirer of his genius. There was always something about his portfolio that felt inconsistent. His early work was mundane, derivative, but then, suddenly, came an explosion of unparalleled brilliance, starting with the Pinnacle. It was a leap in logic and skill that had always baffled historians, but one they chalked up to a master finding his voice. The morning of the demolition was cold, the air thick with the smell of diesel and anticipation. A crowd had gathered behind barriers, their faces a mixture of sadness and excitement. Our foreman gave the signal, and the massive wrecking ball swung, its arc a slow, graceful pendulum of destruction. It struck the upper floors with a deafening roar, a percussive boom that echoed through the city streets. The crowd gasped as the first pieces of the facade crumbled, falling like stone tears down the face of the building. It was a violent, mesmerizing sight, the methodical unmaking of a masterpiece. The great machine continued its work blow after blow, reducing 80 years of history to rubble. I was observing the lower levels, near the foundation, comparing the exposed structure to the original blueprints Croft's own certified copies. As a section of the eastern retaining wall was pulverized, a plume of dust rose like a ghost from a disturbed tomb. The foreman yelled for us to stand clear, but through the settling haze, my eyes caught something. A strange, deliberate recess in the load-bearing wall, a cavity that simply wasn't on Alistair Croft's official plans. My professional curiosity took over, ignoring the foreman's impatient shouts to keep to the schedule. I called for a halt in my sector. Something was wrong. This wasn't a flaw or a structural shortcut. It was intentional, a hidden space built into the very bones of the Pinnacle. I ran my hand over the exposed concrete, feeling the smooth edge of a man-made opening. It was a secret, locked away from the world since the day the concrete was first poured. My heart began to pound with a strange intuition, a feeling that I was standing on the edge of a great precipice. With the help of 2 workers, we carefully chiseled away the surrounding debris. The hollow thud that echoed back confirmed my suspicion. Behind a thin layer of finishing concrete was a dark man-made cavity, just large enough to hold a small container reaching into the cold darkness. My fingers brushed against the corroded surface of metal. We pulled it out into the daylight, a single, rust-eaten metal box, sealed shut not just by its lock, but by the relentless passage of time. The air grew thick with unspoken questions as the crew gathered around, their work forgotten. It took a crowbar and a significant amount of effort to pry the lid open. The groan of tortured metal was the first sound the box had made in nearly a century. Inside, nestled in oilcloth that had mostly decayed, was an astonishing collection. There were rolled-up architectural blueprints, their paper yellowed and brittle with age. Beneath them lay 2 leather-bound diaries and a small, silver-framed photograph. I picked up the photo. It showed a young woman with intelligent, defiant eyes and a small, determined smile, standing proudly on a construction site. I had never seen her before. Unrolling the first blueprint was a moment of sheer disbelief. It was a detailed elevation of the Pinnacle, but with a level of intricate annotation I had never seen in Croft's known work. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and definitively not Alistair Croft's blocky, forceful script. I quickly unrolled another. It was a different building, the celebrated Clarion Hotel, another of Croft's signature designs, and another, and another. All of his most famous works were there, rendered in this same, unfamiliar hand. A colleague shone a flashlight over the documents, and that's when I saw it. Tucked away in the corner of the main Pinnacle blueprint, in the title block where the principal architect's name should be, was a signature. It was faint, partially smudged by time, but under the focused beam of light, the letters were unmistakable. It was not the bold, arrogant scroll of Alistair Croft. It was a graceful, flowing script that spelled out a name I had never encountered in any architecture textbook. Ilara Vance. The name Ilara Vance was a ghost in the machine of history. I spent the next 2 days in the city archives, cross-referencing registries of architects from the 1930s and 40s, searching university alumni records, and scanning census data. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed. There was no registered female architect by that name, no student, no draftsperson. She was a complete unknown, a phantom whose only proof of existence was her secret signature on a masterpiece attributed to another man. The mystery deepened with every dead end. My investigation forced me to look beyond the official records, to imagine a world different from my own. The world of architecture in the 1940s was a fortress built by men, for men. For a woman to even graduate from an architecture program was a rarity. For her to be recognized for her work was nearly impossible. They were often relegated to the background, their ideas absorbed into the work of their male superiors, their names fading from the records until they vanished completely. I realized I wasn't just looking for a person, I was looking for a shadow. Her diaries were the key. The first entry was dated 1938. Her words painted a vivid picture of a young woman burning with a passion for design. She wrote not of buildings as mere structures, but as living organisms, extensions of the human experience. She dreamt of buildings that breathed with their inhabitants, that integrated natural light and green spaces in ways no one else was even considering. Her concepts, her philosophies, were decades ahead of their time, filled with a revolutionary zeal that was both inspiring and, I imagined, deeply threatening to the establishment. The diary spoke of her first job at a prestigious firm in Viridia, the same firm where a young Alistair Croft was also making a name for himself. Her excitement at landing the position quickly soured into a quiet frustration. While her male colleagues were given commissions and design opportunities, she was relegated to drafting revisions for less imaginative men, her own brilliant sketches and models dismissed as charming, but impractical. Her mind was a wellspring of innovation, yet she was being asked to do little more than color within the lines drawn by others. Alistair Croft appears in her diary entries first as a footnote, then as a central character. She describes him as different from the others. He was charming, ambitious, and, most importantly, he seemed to be the only one who recognized the true scope of her talent. He would stay late, talking with her about her radical ideas, praising her vision, and lamenting how the senior partners were too blind to see her genius. He positioned himself as her sole ally, the only person within that stifling boys' club who truly understood her. Reading her words, I could feel her cautious optimism. Alistair understands, she wrote one night. He sees the buildings as I see them. He says that together we could change the face of this city. He speaks of a partnership, a way for my designs to see the light of day. It feels like a lifeline. Perhaps he is the one I have been waiting for. It was a passage filled with the desperate hope of an artist who wanted nothing more than to create, a hope that, I was beginning to fear, had been cruelly and deliberately manipulated. Alistair's proposal, as Ilara detailed in her diary, was a devil's bargain disguised as an opportunity. He explained that the world was not ready for a female architectural visionary. No client, no council, would ever approve a project of this magnitude designed by a woman, but they would approve a project presented by him. He suggested a silent partnership. She would be the mind, the true creator, working in secret. He would be the face, the name, the one who navigated the politics and prejudice to get her buildings made. He promised her it was temporary, a stepping stone until the world was ready to hear her name. Ilara's hesitation is palpable in her writing. She wrestled with the injustice of it, the bitter pill of having to hide her own genius behind a man's name. But her desire to build, to see her visions rise from paper into reality, was an overwhelming force. It was a hunger that every architect understands. The choice was between invisibility with creation, or visibility with nothing. With a heavy heart and a sliver of trust in Alistair's promises, she agreed. Their secret collaboration began that night, a pact that would shape a city and bury a legacy. The dynamic they established was one of intense, clandestine work. Ilara would spend her nights drafting, modeling, and innovating, pushing the boundaries of engineering and aesthetics. Her small apartment became a secret studio filled with sketches and calculations that would one day be hailed as Alistair Croft's genius. He, in turn, would study her work, memorizing her talking points, learning to present her revolutionary ideas as if they were his own spontaneous creations. He became an actor playing the part of an architect, and his stage was the entire city. Their first real test came with a competition to design a new city library. Ilara worked for weeks, pouring all her innovative ideas about public space and light into the design. It was a masterpiece of form and function. Alistair presented it to the city council flawlessly. They won. The victory was euphoric but deeply painful for Ilara. At the celebratory dinner, Alistair was toasted as a visionary. He stood up, basking in the applause, and thanked his talented team, making a vague passing reference to a dedicated assistant, whose help had been invaluable. In the metal box I found a letter from Alistair to Elara written the day after that dinner. It was filled with effusive praise, calling her his secret weapon and his hidden muse. He assured her that her sacrifice was for the greater good of the project and that their day would come. He even included a bonus, a check for $100, a pittance disguised as a generous reward. Reading it now, 80 years later, I felt a cold fury. It wasn't a letter of partnership, it was the chain of a golden cage being locked. Elara's diary from that period is a storm of conflicting emotions. She describes the thrill of walking past the construction site of the library, seeing her lines and angles taking physical form, a dream made real. But she also writes about the profound loneliness of her ghost-like existence. She couldn't share her triumph with anyone. To the world, she was just a lowly draftsperson. The project that should have been the triumphant start of her career was instead the first brick in the wall of her own erasure. The library's success catapulted Alistair Croft into the architectural stratosphere. He was hailed as the new voice of his generation, a maverick who was single-handedly dragging Viridia into the modern age. Commissions began flooding in, each one more ambitious than the last, and for each new project Alistair would come to Elara's apartment, a supplicant seeking her genius. He needed her. He was addicted to her creativity, to the praise and fame it brought him. He was a hollow vessel, and she was the endless wellspring he drew from. This period marked the beginning of her work on what would become the pinnacle. It was to be the tallest, most ambitious skyscraper the city had ever seen, a true statement piece. In her diary, Elara doesn't call it a building. She calls it her ascension. It was her attempt to create something so undeniably brilliant, so utterly hers in its soul, that when the time came for the truth to be revealed, no one could possibly doubt her authorship. She poured every ounce of her being into its design, every sleepless night a sacrifice on the altar of her future vindication. As I cross-referenced the dates in her diary with Alistair Croft's public records, a sickening pattern emerged. Every single one of his award-winning designs, every celebrated project, coincided perfectly with Elara's intense periods of work described in her journals. The few minor projects he undertook on his own in the early days were clumsy and uninspired. He wasn't just her partner, he was her plagiarist. He had built an entire kingdom on stolen ground, and the pinnacle was to be the crown jewel of his fraudulent reign. Elara's design for the pinnacle was revolutionary. She pioneered a new buttressing system and a curtain wall of glass that would allow unprecedented amounts of natural light into a structure of its size. These were the very innovations that had made Alistair Croft a legend. The critics had marveled at his sudden and complete mastery of structural engineering, but it was never his. It was Elara working with textbooks and a slide rule in her tiny apartment, quietly reshaping the future of architecture while the man who would steal her credits slept. My admiration for the building was now transformed into a profound sense of awe for its true creator. I looked at the remaining structure of the pinnacle not as a monument to Alistair Croft, but as Elara Vance's silent towering scream. She had built her masterpiece, a building that touched the clouds, perhaps in the desperate hope that its sheer height would make her, its invisible architect, impossible to ignore forever. The demolition felt different now, no longer the destruction of a landmark, but the desecration of a tomb. The relationship detailed in the diary grew darker. As Alistair's fame grew, so did his paranoia. He became possessive and controlling, isolating Elara from her few friends and colleagues. He insisted that their secret was too precious, that any outside contact could risk exposing them and destroying their careers. He framed it as a necessary protection for their shared enterprise, but the intent was clear in her writing. He was ensuring that she had no one to turn to, no one who would believe her if she ever decided to speak out. Elara became a prisoner in a cage of her own design. Her world shrank to the four walls of her apartment and the clandestine late-night meetings with Alistair. He controlled her finances, providing her with a stipend that was generous enough to live on, but not enough to give her true independence. He was the sole conduit through which her genius could reach the world, and he never let her forget it. She was completely dependent on him, a fact he expertly wielded to keep her compliant and silent. There are entries filled with despair, where she contemplates walking away from it all. But the buildings held her captive. They were her children, and she couldn't bear to abandon them. She would see the Clarion Hotel lit up at night, or watch families enjoying the public plaza she designed, and the pain of her anonymity would be momentarily overshadowed by the pride of creation. It was a cruel, addictive cycle. The very work that was erasing her was also the only thing that gave her a reason to endure. Alistair's manipulation was masterful. He would shower her with praise in private, calling her a goddess of architecture, his better half, the secret to all his success. He would paint a beautiful picture of their future, a time when he would finally reveal her as his partner, shocking the world with the truth. These promises were hollow, but they were all she had to cling to. He sold her a dream of eventual recognition while actively working to ensure it would never, ever happen. But Elara was a genius, and a genius cannot be entirely suppressed. A quiet rebellion began to brew within her. She started to embed tiny, secret signatures into her design's anomalies that were invisible to an untrained eye, but were deeply personal to her. It could be a specific, unusual ratio in a series of window placements, an ornamental detail based on the petals of her favorite flower, or a structural joint that was uniquely and efficiently hers. They were whispers in the walls, her name carved in a language only she understood. In the present, this realization sent a jolt of electricity through me. If these signatures existed, they could be the key to irrefutably proving her authorship across all of Croft's buildings. The anomaly I had found in the foundation of the pinnacle wasn't just a hiding place. It was likely the first of these signatures, a deliberate deviation from the plans he would eventually file under his own name. Her secrets were not just in her diaries. They were in the very fabric of the steel and stone. The initial whispers of Ilara's rebellion were not spoken, but drawn. With the pinnacle's construction well underway, she saw the structure not just as a masterpiece, but as her witness. The time for quiet acceptance was over. One evening, after reading yet another newspaper article that called Alistair a once-in-a-generation visionary for design elements she had bled for, a cold resolve settled in her heart. She confronted him not with fury, but with a quiet, steely demand. She wanted a date, a firm commitment on when he would finally honor their agreement and reveal her name. Alistair's charm for the first time evaporated. He looked at her not as a partner, but as a problem to be managed. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that chilled her to the bone. He told her she was being naive, emotional. "My dear Lara," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "who do you think they would possibly believe? You are a draftswoman. I am Alistair Croft. Your name on those plans would be seen as a forgery, a desperate fantasy. You would be a laughingstock, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Is that what you truly want?" His words were a meticulously crafted weapon, sharpened with the full weight of societal prejudice. He painted a vivid, cruel picture of her ruin. The condescending newspaper articles, the whispers of her being a scorned lover seeking revenge, the professional world closing every door to her. He reminded her that she had no proof beyond her private drawings and her word against his. He wasn't just threatening her career. He was threatening to annihilate her very credibility as a sane, rational woman in a world already predisposed to dismiss her. The threat worked, but not in the way he intended. Alara retreated, but she did not break. His cruelty solidified her purpose. If she could not claim her legacy with her voice, she would embed it into the very steel of her creations. Her work became an obsession. She began altering the final construction blueprints in subtle but significant ways. A series of ventilation grills would be arranged to spell her initials in Morse code. The precise angle of a supporting truss would match the latitude of her childhood home. Her rebellion was now a campaign of cryptographic architecture. Their collaboration, once a vibrant exchange of ideas, became a Cold War fought over drafting tables. The creative energy that had filled her apartment was replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Alistair would pore over her schematics with a new, suspicious eye, sensing a shift in her but unable to pinpoint it. He questioned every line, every measurement that seemed unusual. Ilara in turn became a master of deception, justifying her secret signatures with fabricated engineering principles and complex aesthetic theories that he, in his technical ignorance, was forced to accept. It was a draining, soul-crushing existence. She was building the tallest structure in the city while simultaneously being buried beneath it. The joy of creation was now inextricably linked with the bitterness of her silent protest. She found a grim satisfaction in knowing that her truth was hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of every building Alistair claimed as his own. Her name might not be on a plaque, but it was in the girders in the glass. In the very soul of the city's skyline, a secret waiting for someone with the right eyes to one day read it. Then, everything changed. In the autumn of 1942, as the final floors of the pinnacle were being completed, Alara made a discovery that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. It was a truth that could not be hidden in blueprints or whispered in Morse code. It was a biological fact, a new life growing within her. She was pregnant. And the child's father, the only man she had been with, was the celebrated architect Alistair Croft. The man who was simultaneously the architect of her dreams and the author of her erasure. Her first reaction was not joy, but a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. A child would bind her to Alistair in a way that no secret contract ever could. Yet, as the initial shock subsided, a new dangerous thought began to form. This child was not just a complication. It was leverage. It was undeniable, living proof of their intimacy, of a relationship far deeper than that of a mere architect and his assistant. Perhaps, she thought, with a desperate surge of hope, this would be the one thing that could force him to finally tell the truth. She arranged to meet him at a small, discreet restaurant far from their usual haunts. Her hands trembled as she broke the news, her voice barely a whisper. She watched his face, searching for any sign of emotion, any flicker of shared humanity. She found none. Alistair did not show anger, or shock, or even a hint of happiness. Instead, his face became a pale, expressionless mask. He stared at her, but his eyes were distant, his mind clearly racing, calculating angles and mitigating risks. He wasn't seeing a woman carrying his child. He was seeing a catastrophic threat to his carefully constructed reality. His response, when it came, was swift and brutal. "This," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "is a problem you have created. And it is a problem you will solve." He saw the pregnancy not as a shared responsibility, but as a fatal flaw in her design, a loose end that could unravel everything he had built. The child was a witness who could one day speak. The connection was a liability that could expose his entire life as a lie. His meticulously crafted empire, built on her mind and her silence, was suddenly vulnerable. He laid out his terms with the cold precision of a surgeon. He would give her a sum of money so vast it made her head spin, enough to disappear, to start a new life in a new city, a new country even, and never want for anything. In exchange, she would vanish. She would sign a document, drafted by his lawyers, stating she was leaving her position of her own accord. She would never contact him again, and she would never, under any circumstances, reveal the identity of her child's father. He was offering her a gilded cage on the other side of the world. Alara was trapped. Her heart screamed for her to refuse, to expose him for the monster he was. But her mind, clouded by fear for her unborn child, saw the terrible logic in his ultimatum. To fight him would mean a public scandal. She would be branded an extortionist, a liar, a woman of loose morals. Her child would be born into a world of shame and scandal, forever marked by the disgrace. Alistair wasn't just offering her money. He was offering to spare her child the ruin that he would surely inflict upon her if she dared to defy him. It was the most brutal form of checkmate. Her diary entries from this period are fractured, the elegant script now a desperate scroll. She weighed her options, finding each one leading to a different kind of oblivion. She could stay and fight, sacrificing her child's future for a truth the world was not ready to hear. Or she could accept his terms, saving her child by condemning herself to a living death, becoming a ghost in her own life story. The man who had stolen her legacy was now demanding she surrender her identity as well. All for the sake of the one pure thing their toxic partnership had created. This was Alistair's true genius, she realized. Not in architecture, but in the calculated destruction of a person. He knew her weak point wasn't her ambition, but her heart. He had cornered her, using her own maternal instinct as the final wall in her prison. The choice was an illusion. Both paths led to her erasure. One was a quick public execution. The other a slow, silent fading into nothingness. She had to decide which form of disappearance would do the least harm to the innocent life she now carried. Before she gave him her final answer, she made one last trip to the construction site of the pinnacle. It was late at night, the skeletal frame of the tower piercing the dark sky. This was her child, her firstborn, a monument to her silenced genius. With a surge of defiant purpose, she knew what she had to do. It was not enough to leave her signatures in the design. She had to leave the proof. She had to create a time capsule, a message in a bottle, that could survive the decades and one day tell her story for her. She spent the next week meticulously gathering her most crucial documents. The original blueprints that bore her name, her diaries detailing the secret partnership, and the photograph of herself, a defiant specter at her own creation. She packaged them carefully in the metal box, a small ark containing the truth of her stolen world. This was her final act of rebellion, a desperate gamble placed on the hope that truth, like a well-designed structure, might bend under pressure but would ultimately endure. Her last meeting with Alistair was a cold, transactional affair. His lawyers were present, their faces impassive. She signed the papers without a word, her hand steady as she took the cashier's check. She felt nothing. She was a ghost, performing the last rites of her own life. Alistair did not meet her eyes. He had already moved on, already begun the process of scrubbing her from his history. For him, the problem was solved. A difficult chapter was closed. He could now enjoy the fruits of her genius without the inconvenience of her existence. That very night, using a key she had made from the master plans, Alara Vance entered the construction site of the pinnacle for the last time. She navigated the treacherous, half-finished foundation until she reached the cavity she herself had designed into the eastern retaining wall, a small, perfect void hidden from all official plans. She placed the metal box inside, a testament to her life's work, a seed of truth planted in the heart of the lie. As she sealed the compartment, she whispered a prayer, not to God, but to the future, hoping that one day, someone would have a reason to tear down the walls and find her waiting. And so, Alara Vance vanished. One day she was a ghost in Viridia's architectural scene. The next, she was not even that. There were no farewells, no forwarding address, just an empty apartment and a void where a brilliant mind used to be. Her few acquaintances at the firm were told she had left abruptly, a story that was easy enough to believe. In a world that moved so quickly, the disappearance of a quiet draftswoman was barely a ripple, soon smoothed over by the relentless tide of progress and ambition that she herself had helped to create. Alistair Croft, with practiced gravitas, orchestrated the official narrative. He expressed profound concern and sadness to his senior partners, speaking of Alara's fragile artistic temperament and hinting at a private struggle with a nervous condition. He painted himself as a compassionate mentor who had tried to help a troubled but talented young woman until she had tragically succumbed to her own instability and fled. It was a masterful performance, transforming his act of cruel expulsion into one of benevolent concern. further cementing his reputation as a man of character. With Alara gone, a palpable weight was lifted from Alistair's shoulders. There was no longer a secret to keep, no longer a brilliant, resentful partner to manage. The pinnacle was completed to universal acclaim, and this time, the triumph was entirely his. He accepted the accolades, the design awards, and the magazine covers with an unburdened conscience. He was no longer just playing the part of a genius, he had fully inhabited the role. The lie now so complete that it had become his own personal truth. He was, in his own mind and the world's, a true visionary. The few colleagues who had been friendly with Alara accepted the story with little question. What other explanation was there in the rigidly patriarchal world of the 1940s? It was far easier to believe that a woman had an emotional breakdown than to suspect that a man as respected as Alistair Croft was a fraud. Any quiet suspicions they might have harbored were quickly suppressed. It was safer and simpler to believe the official story. And so, the final traces of Alara Vance were swept away by a collective, convenient amnesia. Meanwhile, Alara began her life in exile. The money was a constant, heavy reminder of the price of her silence. She moved from town to town, a ghost haunted by the skyline she had created but could never again see. Every newspaper article praising Croft was a fresh torment, every photograph of his buildings a dagger in her heart. She lived in a state of perpetual fear, always looking over her shoulder, terrified that Alistair's reach might extend far beyond Viridia, and that he might one day decide that her disappearance was not enough. In a small, quiet town where no one knew her name, she gave birth to a son. She named him Arthur in the face of this new innocent life. Her own identity seemed to matter less. This child was the one pure, true thing she had created, the only legacy that could not be stolen from her. She gave him her own last name, Vance, a small act of defiance. He would not carry the name of the man who had destroyed his mother. He would carry the name of the woman who would spend the rest of her life trying to protect him. Back in the present day, I was anything but quiet. The contents of the metal box felt like a live wire in my hands, a story that demanded to be told. I was convinced this was the single greatest architectural discovery of the century, a revelation that would rewrite history. My mind raced with the implications, with the sheer scale of the injustice that had been hidden for 80 years. I felt a profound, almost personal responsibility to Alara Vance, a woman I had never met but whose voice I could now hear with perfect clarity through the pages of her diaries. My superiors at the demolition firm did not share my enthusiasm. When I presented my findings, they saw only problems. They saw a project delay that would cost millions. They saw a potential lawsuit from the powerful Croft Foundation. They saw a public relations nightmare that could tarnish the firm's reputation. They looked at the diaries and blueprints not as historical artifacts, but as evidence in a case they wanted no part of. My boss ordered me, in no uncertain terms, to hand over the box and forget everything I had seen. I refused. For the first time in my career, I chose a story over a salary. I took an immediate, unpaid leave of absence, dedicating myself entirely to uncovering the truth of Ilara's life and disappearance. My first step was to trace her through official channels, but it was like chasing a phantom down a hall of mirrors. I searched for death certificates, census data, immigration records, and property deeds. Nothing. It was as if she had stepped out of her Viridia apartment in 1942 and simply dissolved into thin air. I scoured her diaries again, page by page, desperately searching for any clue she might have left. A mention of a relative, a favorite city, a childhood home. But her world, as recorded in her journals, had been so thoroughly constricted by Alistair that it seemed to contain nothing beyond their work. He had successfully isolated her, not just from her contemporaries, but from the historical record itself. The trail was 80 years old and stone cold, deliberately erased by a man who had every resource at his disposal to ensure it stayed that way. Realizing the futility of a direct search, I decided to take a different approach. If I couldn't find Alara, perhaps I could find the cracks in Alistair's story. I requested a meeting with the Croft Foundation, the formidable organization tasked with preserving his legacy. I presented myself as a historical consultant working on a retrospective of the Pinnacle's construction. I was granted a meeting with the Foundation's executive director, a woman whose demeanor suggested she was less a historian and more a high priestess at the altar of Alistair Croft. I began by asking about the firm's staffing during the Pinnacle era, eventually guiding the conversation to the role of draftswomen. Finally, I asked her directly. I came across a passing mention of a woman named Alara Vance. Do you have any records of her? The director's smile tightened. Without a word, she retrieved a thin file from an archive. It contained exactly what I expected, a signed letter of resignation and a patronizing memo from Croft himself, detailing his concerns about her erratic behavior and wishing her well in her recovery. It was the official narrative, perfectly preserved in acid-free paper. The director closed the file with a definitive snap. She warned me, with a thinly veiled threat, against giving credence to unsubstantiated rumors that occasionally surfaced about Croft. She spoke of the importance of protecting a great man's legacy from postmodern revisionism. Her defensiveness was more revealing than any document. I left their marble-clad headquarters not with answers, but with a renewed certainty. The Foundation wasn't protecting a history, it was guarding a secret, and that secret's name was Elara Vance. Blocked by the official record, I turned to the only other primary sources available to me, the buildings themselves. Elara's diary had mentioned her secret signatures, her cryptographic rebellion. This, I realized, was where I might find the truth that documents could not provide. I gathered the official blueprints of every major Croft project, the ones filed with the city under his name. I then began a meticulous, painstaking process of comparing them, line by line, against the original plans Elara had hidden in her time capsule. And there they were. The discrepancies were subtle, but undeniable. On the facade of the Clarion Hotel, a pattern of ornamental metalwork, dismissed by critics as a random flourish, was in fact a perfect geometric representation of the molecular structure of graphite, the material and the pencils she used to design it. The acoustics in the Grand Concert Hall were designed around a mathematical progression based on her own birth date. It was a language of genius, hidden in plain sight. This was more than just a smoking gun. This was an entire arsenal. The patterns were too complex, too personal, and too consistent across all the projects to be mere coincidence. I felt a thrilling connection to her, an architect speaking to another across an ocean of time. She had known that her diaries could be dismissed as fiction, but the buildings themselves could not lie. They were her witnesses, and they were finally beginning to testify. He could steal her name, but he could not steal the unique fingerprint of her mind. My path forward was now clear. The architectural proof was undeniable to a trained eye, but it wasn't human. It wouldn't be enough to convince the world. I needed to find the one piece of her story that Alistair couldn't control or erase. I had to find her son. The search shifted from an architectural mystery to a genealogical manhunt. I was no longer just trying to restore a legacy. I was trying to reunite a son with the truth of the mother he likely never knew. The challenge was immense. I was looking for a man now likely in his 80s who was born 80 years ago with no father listed on his birth certificate. The surname Vance was my only real lead. I spent weeks submerged in digital archives, chasing down hundreds of potential Arthur Vances, hitting one dead end after another. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, and the trail was so cold it felt frozen solid. I was beginning to lose hope, fearing that this last living link to Elara was lost forever. I returned to the metal box, to the contents of Elara's life. My eyes fell on the cashier's check Alistair had given her. It was a long shot, but it was the only financial record I had. I began a bureaucratic battle with the bank's archives department, requesting access to records from 1942. After weeks of requests and rejections, a young archivist, intrigued by the mystery, took pity on me. She dug deep into their storage and found it. A record showing the check had been cached in a tiny, remote logging town in Oregon called Havenwood, a perfect place to disappear. I was on the next flight. Havenwood was a place where time seemed to move more slowly. A town nestled among ancient trees that felt a world away from the relentless ambition of Viridia. I went straight to the county records office. And there, under the V's for 1943, I found him, Arthur Vance, born February 2nd. Mother's name, Elara Vance. Father's name, unlisted. It was him. A wave of triumphant energy surged through me. He was real. The trail, however, quickly went cold again. Property records showed Elara and her son had lived in a small rental cottage, but for less than 5 years. They had vanished from Havenwood as completely as they had from Viridia. I started speaking to the town's oldest residents. Most remembered nothing, but one woman, a retired librarian in her late 90s, remembered them. She recalled a quiet, sad woman who always carried a sketchbook and her small, solemn son. Then, she gave me the piece I was missing. She recalled the day Elara left. It was sudden. A strange man in a dark car and an expensive city suit had been seen in town asking about her. The next morning, Elara was gone. The librarian had always assumed she was a woman running from a dangerous past. The story sent a chill down my spine. Alistair hadn't just bought her silence. He had been enforcing it. She hadn't left Havenwood. She had been forced to run again. The librarian, seeing the look on my face, gave me one final piece of the puzzle. She remembered the local pastor at the time expressing great concern for the little boy. He had made arrangements for him, fearing the mother was not coming back. He had placed the boy in the care of the church. I followed the trail from the church records, which led me to an orphanage 2 states away, St. Jude's Home for Boys. The official record stated Arthur Vance was relinquished due to maternal abandonment. It was a lie, but it was a lie designed to save him. The orphanage records were the final link. After an agonizing week of waiting, a social worker confirmed that Arthur Vance had lived there until he was 18. He had never been adopted, and they had a last known address for him, from when he had registered for Social Security benefits decades ago. The address was in a quiet suburb just 300 miles from Viridia. After fleeing across the country, Elara had ensured her son would grow up in the shadow of the skyline she had built, a silent, unknowing guardian of her legacy. I drove for 6 hours, a feeling of immense, terrifying anticipation building with every mile. I stood on the doorstep of a modest, tidy home, rehearsing the words that would append an old man's entire life. He answered the door, a man with kind, tired eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of unanswered questions. I introduced myself and, with trembling hands, I laid the blueprints and the diaries on his coffee table. I showed him the photograph of the young, brilliant woman standing proudly on a construction site. "Arthur," I said, "I believe this is your mother." Arthur Vance stared at the photograph, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the image of the young woman who was until this moment little more than a ghost in his life story. He looked from her face to the elegant signature on the blueprints, then to the diaries filled with a handwriting he'd never seen. He said nothing for a very long time, the silence in his modest living room stretching for what felt like an eternity, thick with the weight of 80 years of unspoken history and unanswered questions. I watched him, giving him the space his shock demanded. This wasn't just history to him, it was the entire foundation of his identity, a story of abandonment he had carried his whole life. Now being systematically dismantled on his coffee table, he finally looked up at me, his eyes clouded with a mixture of confusion and a deep, ancient pain. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I was told she left me, that she was unwell." He spoke the words as if they were a bitter creed he had been forced to recite for a lifetime. Gently I guided him through the story, not as a historian presenting a discovery, but as a narrator delivering a message. I showed him the entry where she first sketched the tower that would become the pinnacle. I pointed to the passage where she wrote about her excitement and terror upon learning she was pregnant. Her words were not those of an unstable woman, but of a brilliant, besieged artist fighting for her work and a terrified mother, trying to protect her child from a world that had turned against her. His carefully constructed walls of resignation began to crumble. He picked up one of the diaries, his fingers tracing the faded ink of her script, as if he could absorb the truth through touch alone. The story of his mother's instability, a narrative that had defined his past, was dissolving into a far more tragic and complex reality. He was not the son of a woman who had abandoned him. He was the son of a woman who had been erased, a genius who had been ruthlessly silenced by a man the world had celebrated as a hero. Then, with a resolve that seemed to pull him from his chair, Arthur walked over to a large dust-covered cedar chest in the corner of the room. He told me it was the only thing he had from his mother, left for him by the pastor who had placed him in the orphanage. He had looked through it as a boy, finding only a few baby clothes and a worn teddy bear. He had never had the heart to look again. He lifted the heavy lid, the scent of old wood and forgotten time filling the air. Beneath the items he remembered was a false bottom. He pried it open with a pocket knife, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, protected from the years, was another, smaller box. It contained a third diary, its pages filled with a more hurried, desperate script. With it was a stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and a single folded document. Arthur unfolded the document. It was a birth certificate. His birth certificate, and on the line for the father's name, in his mother's elegant hand, was a single, damning name: Alistair Croft. The final diary filled in the missing pieces. It chronicled her desperate flight from Viridia, her time in Havenwood, and the constant, gnawing fear that Alistair would find her. She wrote of the man in the dark car, confirming my discovery, an agent sent by Croft to ensure her continued silence. Her words painted a portrait of a mother on the run, not from her responsibilities, but from a powerful man who would stop at nothing to protect his lie. Her decision to leave Arthur was not an act of abandonment, but an act of protection. Then came the letters. Arthur untied the ribbon and began to read. They were addressed to him, one for every birthday she had missed. "My dearest Arthur," the first began. "Today you are 5 years old. I watched you from the end of the street as you played. You have my eyes. Please know that every line I ever drew, every building that touches the sky, I made for you. I am sorry I cannot be there. My love for you is the one thing they could never steal." Arthur's shoulders shook as he read, a lifetime of silent grief finally finding its release in quiet, racking sobs. The letters were a testament to a mother's unbreakable love and a genius's enduring spirit. In them, she explained her work, her secret signatures, her hope that one day he would see the buildings and somehow feel her presence. The last letter, written many years later, was filled with a sense of finality. Her health was failing. She begged his forgiveness and told him that leaving him was the hardest and most important thing she had ever done. It was her final, desperate design, a plan to ensure his survival, even at the cost of her own heart. A lifetime of perceived rejection was washed away by a flood of truth. He was not abandoned, he was protected. He was not forgotten. He was loved with a fierce, desperate, and silent passion. We sat together for hours as he read every word, absorbing the story of the mother he never knew. When he finally looked up, the confusion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. The pain was still there, but now it was forged into something new. It was the foundation for a fight. That night, a partnership was formed between an old man who had just discovered his past and a young architect obsessed with correcting it. We laid out the two halves of Ellora's story, her diaries from Viridia and her final journal from exile, and they fit together perfectly. We had her words, we had the architectural proof, and now we had the birth certificate. The undeniable link to Alistair Croft. The narrative was complete. A powerful, heartbreaking story of stolen genius and a mother's ultimate sacrifice. We knew a legal battle against the Croft Foundation would be financial suicide. They would bury us in motions and legal fees. Our strength was not in money or power, but in the undeniable truth of Alara's story. We needed to take our case to the highest court of all, the court of public opinion. We needed a journalist, someone with the skill to tell the story and the courage to challenge a powerful institution. I knew of only one person who fit that description. A Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter named Evelyn Reed. Getting past Evelyn Reed's gatekeepers was a challenge. I sent dozens of emails, each one more urgent than the last, all of them unanswered. Finally, I sent a single sentence. I can prove, with forensic architectural evidence, that Alistair Croft was a fraud, and I have the 80-year-old son of his victim to corroborate it. The next morning, my phone rang. She agreed to give us 15 minutes. She was sharp, skeptical, and made it clear that her time was not to be wasted on unsubstantiated theories. We didn't begin with the emotional story. We began with the science. I laid out the blueprints, Alara's originals next to Croft's official filings. I walked Evelyn through the cryptographic signatures, explaining the complex mathematical and personal references hidden within the designs. I saw a flicker of interest in her sharp, analytical eyes. This was tangible, verifiable. It was evidence, not just accusation. She leaned forward, her initial skepticism replaced by the focused intensity of a predator who has caught a scent. Then, Arthur spoke. He didn't speak of lawsuits or legacies. He spoke of a life spent wandering, of the cold loneliness of the orphanage, of the shame he carried believing his own mother had not wanted him. He then read aloud from one of her unsent letters. His voice was steady, but freighted with the sorrow of a lifetime. In that moment, he wasn't an accuser. He was just a son, finally able to share his mother's story. That was when Evelyn Reed put down her pen. She looked at both of us and said, "Tell me everything." Evelyn Reed's investigation moved with the speed and force of a hurricane. She brought in a team of the nation's top architectural forensics experts, who after weeks of analysis, delivered a unanimous and explosive verdict. The design innovations attributed to Croft were categorically the work of a single, different architect, one whose signature style was present in Alara's hidden documents. They called the consistency of her hidden language as unique and irrefutable as a fingerprint. Her team also unearthed a pattern of behavior. They found records of other complaints against Croft, of smaller ideas stolen from junior partners, of a man who was known in his early days for his ambition, not his talent. They interviewed the families of former employees, building a mosaic of a man who was ruthless, charming, and pathologically driven to win at any cost. The story was no longer just about Alara. It was about the system that had enabled a man like Alistair Croft to thrive. The article detonated on a Sunday morning, a front page that sent shockwaves through the worlds of art, architecture, and history. The story was everywhere, a viral sensation fueled by 80 years of suppressed injustice. The Croft Foundation responded with predictable fury, issuing a statement that called the story a vicious fabrication and threatening the largest libel lawsuit in the country's history. They tried to paint Arthur as a grifter and me as a fame-seeking crank, but they had fundamentally misjudged the power of Alara's story. Evelyn Reed didn't flinch. She responded to their threats by publishing the entire 300-page architectural analysis on the newspaper's website, free for anyone to read. She released audio clips of Arthur reading his mother's letters. The public was no longer just reading a story. They were hearing the evidence. The Foundation's aggressive tactics backfired, making them look like bullies trying to silence a victim. The hashtag her name was ELARA began trending worldwide. The tide of public opinion was turning into a tsunami. Architectural schools announced panels to review Croft's legacy. Museums began adding asterisks to his name on their wall plaques. The demolition of the pinnacle remained halted, the building now a de facto shrine. People left bouquets of flowers and notes of apology at its base, transforming the site from a symbol of a great man's genius into a monument to a great woman's stolen life. Then came the phone call that broke the Foundation's back. A 94-year-old man, a former draftsman at Croft's firm, contacted Evelyn Reed. In a clear, unwavering voice, he confirmed everything. He remembered Alara Vance. He called her the soul of the office. He described Alistair's cruelty, her quiet resilience, and the day she simply vanished. His first-hand account was the final, unassailable piece of the puzzle. The Foundation's wall of denial, so carefully maintained for decades, finally came crashing down. Analisando o texto como todo até agora, acredito que ele está se desenvolvendo de forma excelente. A estrutura narrativa que alterna entre a investigação de Leo no presente e a trágica história de Alara no passado cria uma tensão narrativa e um peso emocional muito eficazes. Os personagens são bem construídos, com motivações claras, e a progressão da trama é lógica e cativante. A forma como as pistas, os diários, as assinaturas arquitetônicas e, finalmente, a descoberta de Arthur se conectam cria uma narrativa coesa e gratificante. que está bem encaminhada para uma conclusão poderosa. Within 24 hours of the old draftsman's testimony, the Croft Foundation's legal threats evaporated. They issued a terse two-sentence press release announcing they were cooperating with all historical inquiries. The following week, their entire board of directors resigned. A new board, composed of respected historians and architectural ethics professors, was appointed with a single clear mandate to uncover the full truth and make amends, no matter the cost to the foundation or the name of its founder. The public retraction was a global media event. The foundation's new director, a woman renowned for her work in historical restoration, stood before the world's press and delivered a stark, unflinching apology. She spoke not of Alistair Croft, but of Ella Vance, acknowledging her as the true mind behind the city's most beloved landmarks. She announced the immediate launch of a program to posthumously award Elara all the accolades Croft had received, and to redirect all of the foundation's considerable assets toward scholarships for women in architecture. The name of Alistair Croft, once a symbol of genius, became a byword for deceit. His fall from grace was swift and absolute. Universities began renaming the Alistair Croft wings of their architecture schools. The city council voted unanimously to strip his name from every street, plaza, and public building. Crews of workers were dispatched across Viridia, and with the quiet grind of power tools and the pry of crowbars, they began the physical act of his erasure, removing the bronze letters that had spelled out his life for nearly a century. His books were pulled from publication, reissued with new forwards that detailed the controversy and credited Elara Vance as the sole author of the designs within. Documentaries were made, not about his life, but about his deception. He became a cautionary tale, a historical footnote in the much larger, more important story of the woman he had tried to bury. His legacy was not just diminished, it was entirely consumed by the brilliance of the woman he had wronged, his shadow completely vanquished by her light. Inversely, the world's fascination with Elara Vance grew into a global phenomenon. Museums scrambled to organize exhibitions of her work, displaying her original blueprints and diary pages like sacred texts. Biographers and filmmakers vied for the rights to her story. She became a posthumous icon, a symbol of perseverance and silenced genius. Her name invoked in conversations about gender equality, artistic integrity, and the very nature of historical truth. She was finally taking her rightful place in the pantheon of architectural masters for Arthur Vance. This public reckoning was both surreal and deeply healing. He was no longer the son of an absent mother. He was the proud guardian of a monumental legacy. He took no money from the foundation, asking only that they fund the translation and publication of his mother's diaries in their entirety. He wanted the world to know her, not just through her work, but through her own words, her own voice. He dedicated his remaining years to this task, finding a profound sense of purpose in ensuring her story was told fully and truthfully. The fate of the pinnacle, the building that had started it all, became a subject of intense public debate. The demolition was, of course, permanently cancelled. The idea of destroying Elara Vance's masterpiece was now unthinkable. Instead, a new plan was forged, one born from the public's desire for restorative justice. The tower would not just be preserved, it would be transformed. It would become the Elara Vance Museum of Architecture and Design, a living monument to her life, her work, and all the forgotten creators like her. I was, to my astonishment, asked to lead the project. It felt like the culmination of my own journey, from a reluctant admirer of a fraud to a key player in the restoration of a true genius. My firm, eager to distance itself from its earlier stance, gave me their full backing. We used Elara's own diaries and her hidden blueprints as our guide, ensuring that every detail of the museum's design, from the lighting to the layout of the exhibits, was something that she herself would have approved of, a final collaboration across time. The grand opening of the museum, 2 years later, was an international event. Architects, historians, and artists from around the world gathered at the base of the tower. At the entrance, where Alistair Croft's name had once been emblazoned, now stood Elara Vance's elegant signature, carved into the stone. Arthur Vance, now a frail but beaming 96-year-old, cut the ceremonial ribbon. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that felt like a standing ovation 80 years in the making. A final, thunderous acknowledgement of her genius. Inside, the museum told her story from the beginning. It showcased her childhood sketches, her university notebooks, and the brilliant, radical designs she created in her small apartment. The final exhibit was the metal box itself, displayed in a simple glass case at the heart of the museum, a humble, rusted container that had held a truth more powerful and enduring than any skyscraper. It was a testament to her foresight, a final, brilliant design for her own vindication, a plan that had worked perfectly. The story of Elara Vance had a profound ripple effect, inspiring a global movement within the arts and sciences. Historians began to re-examine the careers of other great men, searching for the forgotten figures, the silent partners and uncredited assistants, who may have been the true source of their genius. It was the beginning of a great historical reckoning, a collective effort to find and celebrate the countless other Elaras whose names had been lost to time and ambition. My own life was forever changed. I left the world of commercial demolition and dedicated myself to historical preservation, seeking out other forgotten stories hidden in the foundations of old buildings. Arthur lived to see his mother's diaries become international bestsellers before he passed away peacefully at the age of 98. He was buried beside his mother, whose previously unmarked grave he had located and honored with a simple headstone that read, "Alara Vance, architect, mother finally at peace." Alara Vance's story, while fictional, reflects that of countless real women whose contributions have been forgotten or stolen. If you know a story, real or not, that deserves to be told, share it in the comments. Let's continue to give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge what we think we know about the past. And don't forget to activate notifications.